我们是不是可以开始了？应该是可以了。他现在已经提示录屏了，所以我们就开始吧。Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be the host of the panel B, T1BP. Of course, first of all, I would like to thank the fellow participants for overcoming the jet lag and still sit on the other side of the computer because it was almost morning in Beijing time. Secondly, I would like to thank the organizing committee for trusting me and letting me be one of the hosts today. First of all, I'm Yue Liping, coming from School of Economics and Management, Northwest University. In fact, rather than a host, I would like to be a service. I will try my best to coordinate and serve everyone. So let's begin.
Hello, what presentation do you want me to begin with?
The first in the list, the first is what? Sorry, I just look the abstracts. And one of the paper, just a case of Burkina Faso.
Yeah, the paper is on. Can I come in?
Yeah. Of course.
Okay. The first presentation we have
Welcome to this presentation
is on
urbanization due to displacement.
Rapid urbanization due to displacement. The case of Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso is a country in West Africa, and I'm Dr. George Onatu. I'm co-chairing with Liping Yu. Both of us will be chairing this particular session. I'm from University of Johannesburg, Faculty of Engineering and Built Environment, and I've been part of ICCCASU since 2017-2018. So it is an honor to be with each and every one of you today. I equally thank the organizing committee, Tong Tong and Hua, for having been able to give us this very opportunity. While we are actually looking into this topic, unfortunately, Stephanie, who will be making this presentation together with Ian Due, Stephanie, for one reason, she could not be able to make it to this conference. So she sent her apologies and sent her colleague. Brief introduction, please. Stephanie is currently leading the UN Habitat Burkina Faso country program. We are actually interested in implementing projects within the humanitarian development. She built on various experiences from UN Habitat program in the past. Prior to joining UN Program Development Branch, Stephanie worked in UN Habitat Urban Planning Department in terms of Metropolitan Planning Unit. Before joining UN Habitat, she equally worked in Geneva, managing a large-scale restoration project. She has a master's degree in architecture from Technical University Munich and has a postgraduate communication and marketing. She's currently a national of and speaks English, Spanish, and learning Arabics. So this is the bio of Stephanie, and Technica, you can now be able to show us her presentation. Thank you.
Welcome to this presentation on rapid urbanization due to displacement, the case of Burkina Faso. My name is Stephanie Luz. I'm a program manager in Habitat's office in Burkina Faso, Regional Office for Africa. Let me give you some country background on Burkina Faso. As you can see on the map, Burkina Faso is a landlocked country in West Africa, and it's among the world's least developed countries. Even though the level of urbanization is still low, many cities, specifically secondary and further small cities, have been growing fast. And as you can see, while in the 1980s, there were only a few places in the countries which were actually large enough to be called cities. By now, you can see on the right side that there are many places actually where people have really gathered, and a lot of cities have reached a size and are still growing rapidly. So first of all, you have the capital, Ouagadougou, but then also due to push and pull factors, there is a strong increase of urbanization in the small and secondary cities in the country. And one of the reasons is the Sahel conflict. The Sahel crisis has actually been going on for quite some time now and has led to large-scale displacements in the region. That includes Mali and Niger, where the conflict has been going for a long time, but it has now also spilled over to Burkina Faso. And as you can see on the bottom side of the slide, by now more than 1.2 million people are internally displaced and really need humanitarian aid. Displacement in Burkina Faso is mainly an urban phenomenon, with some cities actually having their population been tripled or doubled in the last 1 or 2 years, which of course puts cities in a very dire situation, and specifically those where resources and capacities for increased urbanization was already low before the crisis. What happens when a city grows fast? Well, first of all, of course, it becomes more dense, but then also, as you can see on the picture, there is often the phenomenon of unplanned urban sprawl. That means people live in unplanned settlements, which are underserviced, and so people don't have access to any sort of services. They live in inadequate housing situations. There's no access to water, there's no access to electricities. Health centers and education facilities are needed. There's also, of course, a strong increase in competition on land, on food, on jobs, and the rise of inequality, but also urban poverty, is a big problem in many cities. Rapid urban growth also has a strong impact on environmental degradation, because where there are no services for water and waste provided, the environment slightly starts to increase. So what happens in the cities in the north, where displacement is actually one of the biggest phenomena? As you can see, there's been a huge level of solidarity by host communities who have taken in a lot of IDPs and are now actually helping them to find solutions. But while some have been taken in by host families, others have actually settled in those unplanned and underserviced environments in the outskirts of cities with no access to water, sanitation, and of course inadequate housing. This is a picture showing Kongousi, a city in the central north region where displacement has been now taking place since over 2 years. As you can see, those tents that have been provided are in many cases already starting to be worn out, and there is of course no access to water. The nearest water point for those families is about 2 kilometers away. And women actually face strong risk of gender-based violence when they have to pick up firewood in the nearby forests. This also, of course, leads to environmental degradation. And the situation is really difficult for those people living. As the situation begins to become protracted, with many IDPs living in those areas for up to 2 to 3 years by now, they've started to build more permanent structures, but in unplanned and underserviced areas of the cities. Those are neighboring local communities, which of course are living in an inadequate urban environment and are also people in vulnerable situations. Those permanent structures in those unplanned urban areas will increase the risk of long-term slums because no services are provided, no water, no electricity, no adequate public space, which in the end, including the distance to any sort of employment opportunities, reduces the ability of IDPs for longer-term self-reliance. The protectedness of the situation also leads to increased tensions between different communities and is specifically difficult for women, children and youth as they don't have any access to sanitation services. COVID-19 has, of course, made the situation even more difficult with economy and with it the informal sector, where most IDPs have found some income generation possibilities going down. And of course, if you live in a situation where you don't have access to water or sanitation and no way of keeping distant, you are at risk of COVID-19, but also, of course, other diseases. People living in unplanned urban settlements are also, of course, of risk as of other risks, such as climate change impacts, because where there's no planning, there is no measures to actually reduce the risk of flooding. And so those people who are vulnerable because of their displacement situation already are in further risk of additional horrible things happening to them and increasing their level of vulnerability. So what needs to be done so that urbanization can have a long-term positive impact on the country's social, economic, environmental development? Well, first of all, cities need to be planned for. For achieving the SDGs and therefore an economic, social and environmental development, Burkina needs to invest in the urbanization. Investing in urbanization will not only help to achieve the goals set under the goal 11, but it really also impacts the country's ability to achieve the objectives set for other global goals, which include sanitation, which include reduced urban poverty, but also food security, and of course, a lot of the other goals as well. The New Urban Agenda has already identified many different ways how states and governments can actually promote sustainable urbanization. So at national level, but also at local level, urban policies can be implemented and can be drafted. There needs to be an increase in capacity for urban planning and design. There is a strong need for inclusive urban governance and for good and strong legislation. Municipal finance has to be increased and also local economic development has to be driven forward. Most cities need strengthened capacity for local implementation as well. So here are some examples what UN Habitat advocates for sustainable urbanization. We need an integrated approach. That means we need cross-sectoral coordination. Urbanization is not a sector. It actually needs to be cross-sectoral by nature because you have to make sure housing, social services, wash, education, health, administrative services, but also connectivity to jobs, to infrastructure and food systems and local economic development are accessible for all. You need all levels of governance because some policies are actually made at national level while the implementation happens often at local level, with local actors being first in line, specifically in displacement contexts. You need to include those who are in vulnerable situations in participatory and inclusive processes for urban development to make sure their voices are heard. You need tailored solutions for the specific local context, and there needs to be increased capacity for local implementation. And in a crisis context, what do we actually promote? There need to be area-based approaches because, as we saw before, IDPs live in the same underserviced areas as host population. So by improving the urban environment, all people living in that neighborhood will benefit, and that will increase social cohesion. There needs to be a cooperation between local level actors and those people providing support, may it be national level, but also may it be people like international organizations. And there needs to be an inclusion of those people in the vulnerable situations in programming and implementation. Strengthening the coordination and cooperation between humanitarian development and peace actors, the so-called humanitarian peace development nexus approach, is extremely important to make sure that no parallel processes are being established and that the investments made by humanitarian aid actors is actually going into longer-term development. Because in the end, those investments need to make sure that they're transformative changes and that there are a reduction of root causes to the conflict, but also in the longer term to reduce climate change impact. What we need is a more inclusive society, a healthy living environment, and a rebuild trust in government authorities and rebuilding silence to all sorts of shocks. Let me close here. There are some references that I can share with you, and please do reach out if you have any further questions or contact our website. Thank you very much for your attention.
Bonsoir à tout le monde. Et nous allons nous entretenir avec vous sur la question.
Okay, now we will go to another presentation. Do panel chairs want to say something?
Next presentation is by Chen Yang. He's presenting on China integrated rural urban development, a development mode outside the planetary urbanization paradigm. Chen Yang is a PhD candidate in School of Planning, University of Waterloo, Canada. He's a researcher, and his research area and interest include urban resettlement, urbanization, urban form, and urban modeling in Chinese cities. He's a professional architect and worked in China for several years. And he's joining us in this particular plenary session from China. Please, you can go ahead to play his recorded presentation. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chen Yang, and I am a PhD candidate at the School of Planning, University of Waterloo, Canada. The topic of today is China's integrated urban-rural development mode outside the planetary urbanization paradigm. This work is co-authored with my supervisor, Professor Zhu Chen, and I hope you could enjoy my presentation. So the planetary urbanization as a new paradigm shift in urban geography has furnished geographers with an inclusive theoretical bedrock to conceptualize the ongoing radical urbanization processes in Africa, Asia, and Southern America. However, this notion is inherently Western, so it has obscured and ignored some key aspects of urbanization when viewed from the outside. Therefore, this paper aims to place China's urbanization process in the broad discourse of planetary urbanization so as to, first, critically reflect on the theory of planetary urbanization from the outside, particularly China's case, and second, introduce China's urban-rural integrated development mode to the conceptual framework of planetary urbanization. We first carried out a literature review. We touched upon the most up-to-date contribution made to urban geography, especially the planetary urbanization, and we also explored some critiques to the theory. And we mentioned that there are epistemological alternatives to planetary urbanization, such as planetary suburbanization, the paradigm of southern urbanism, the urbanization tool, and the view from the outside. So from this point onwards, this paper is not a critique of planetary urbanization, rather a dialogue between the notion with China's urbanization praxis. Then we try to conceptualize China's urbanization. So China's urbanization has undergone a series of paradigm shifts where urban-rural relations have been subjected to intense transformations. And since 2002, the coordinated urban-rural development was brought to the fore, followed by a series of policy reforms that aim to address the drawback and lacking urban rural development. So the account as to why the capitalist mode of urbanization has not caused much trouble for China lies in China's counter-urbanization measures in history, including the People's Commune movement in China, the Down to the Countryside movement, the Hukou region, the small-town enterprises, and the rural revitalization. We use the city of Hangzhou as an example to introduce the urban-rural integrated development in China. Being a representative of coastal metropolises and one of the pilot cities for policy initiatives in China, Hangzhou enjoys a relatively high urbanization rate at around 77% in 2019. And theoretically, Hangzhou has entered a stage of fully urbanized based on Kingsley-Davis S-curve, which lays a solid foundation for the promotion and implementation of urban-rural integration. So this figure shows the population change in the last couple of years in Hangzhou. From 2008 to 2019, the urbanization rate of Hangzhou increased from 69% to 77%, with a yearly increase rate of 0.7%. Meanwhile, the population of urban residents increased from 3.4 million to 5.36 million, with the proportion rising from 50% to 67%. The trend also indicates a significant decrease in the rural population. The statistics showcase that the urban-rural population migration has entered a stable stage of two-way transition. In addition to the demographics, the employment structure influx also suggests the trend of the declining primary sector and the rising service sector. Within the rural population, less than a quarter remains engaged in agricultural work. As Brenner and Schmidt also noted, the expansion of large-scale industrial agriculture has transformed the economic, environmental, and social structure of rural areas. Hangzhou has done a relatively successful job in balancing urban-rural development with the lowest income gap compared with other major metropolises in the Yangtze Delta region and that of national. Indeed, very few cities have managed to keep this income ratio lower than 2, and Hangzhou has maintained this record since 2013. This accomplishment can be attributed to Hangzhou's long tradition of rural economy that siphons talents, capital, technology, and other factors from urban. Two-way flow between urban and rural mainly attributes to three dynamics. First, the maturity of the high-speed rail network and mobile internet has weakened the attractiveness of the central city. Second, the urbanization has hit a bottleneck and stagnated in the eastern regions, rendering the two-way mobility trending. And third, too high an urbanization rate of 85% as in the developed countries is not suitable for traditional agricultural countries like China. In this context, the Hangzhou government has employed various strategies to facilitate the reorientation and integration of urban-rural development. First off, it should be acknowledged that the rural villages are heterogeneous regarding their historical, socio-economic, and geographic condition. Second, industrial upgrading has been a potent tool in achieving urban-rural integration in Hangzhou. Third, the innovative rural land policy reform has rendered the form of urban-rural integration more flexible. To implement the integrated urban-rural development, villages were classified first based on their current conditions. 4 types of classified villages are identified: featured villages, clustered villages, urban peripheral villages, and deteriorated villages. In 2018, there were 316 featured villages, accounting for 13%, 1,278 clustered villages, accounting for 53%, 715 urban peripheral villages, accounting for 30%, and 91 deteriorated villages, accounting for 4% in Hangzhou. The structured classification of villages facilitates further planning and implementation of targeted policies. With the systematic planning guidance, local villages have undergone dramatic changes regarding industrial structure, lifestyle, and rural environment. For instance, from 2013, Daijia village has shifted from livestock farming in the 90s to health and tourism industry. Currently, 85% of rural residents live in newly built townhouses and rely on Longjiale, literally means delights in farm guest houses, as the primary source of income. 30,000 to 40,000 RMB per year. Thus far, it is evident that the rural realm has played a proactive role in forging urban-rural integrated development under a top-down planning framework that leverages the rural resources to channel in capital and other urban resources. We argue that the key to the explanation of this theoretical mismatch is somehow obvious. China has never embraced a capitalist mode of production completely, even with the proliferation of neoliberalism. And the authoritarian state are proactive in exercising its powerful planning intervention in urban development. By law the list, we propose this conceptual framework of planetary urbanization in China. In contrast to the original framework, we highlight the role of rural revitalization as another important force that shapes the planetary landscape. Rural revitalization involves land consolidation and population concentration, industrial upgrading, the construction of infrastructure and public facilities, and institutional changes. The urban-rural integration binds concentrated urbanization with rural revitalization through the planning intervention of China's state. While market force and capitalist model production maintain the interconversion of such movements, it is the authoritarian and blueprint planning that foregrounds the non-urban realm when unraveling China's contemporary urbanization. We believe that this framework is much pertinent to China's context and could inform further studies on China's urbanization. The references are provided as below. Thank you very much for listening. Please feel free to contact me via email if you are interested in my research and need any further information. Thank you again.
Hello, everyone.
The panel chair can present
the last presentation is by my colleague who is equally co-chairing this session with me, is Liping Yu. She'll be presenting on granary and the ritual, a study of the settlement intentions of new urban migrants under the background of regional competition. Li Pingyu is from School of Economics and Management from Northwest University of China. She's a reputable researcher and an academic, and she has quite a very extensive years of experience both in teaching and in supervision. So we now give our technical support team permission to please replay her presentation. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It is a great honor for me to join the conference. My name is Zhang Meilin. I come from Economics and Management School of Northwest University, which is located in Shanxi, Xi'an, China. This paper I cooperated with Professor Li Ping, who is my tutor. Today, I will introduce you a study on settlement intentions of new urban migrants in the context of regional competition. And today, my presentation is divided into 5 parts. That is, study overview, research review, research method, conclusion, and innovations. Here, let's look at where the story begins. Lately, the data of the 7th nationwide population census is freshly released, and we can see that the mobile population is 375 million, and that is nearly 70% increase compared to the 6th nationwide population census, which is released in 2010. And the mobile population actually has played an important role in expanding the size of regional markets and stimulating regional economic vitality, but it has also intensified inter-regional competition. And this paper is written under the background of this phenomena and events. What's more, in 2018, China's National Health Commission published the China's Mobile Population Development Report, and this report also released a data space which this paper is based on. And we want to explore factors influencing settlement intention of new urban migrants. In this way, can migration policy be better improved, and thus local government can better attract talents and develop their economy. And this paper wants to answer 2 questions. The first is, how do life needs of new urban migrants affect their behavior of settlement? The second is, the interaction among different levels of needs. This paper divides the life needs of new urban migrants into 2 levels. The first is physical life needs, and the second is spiritual life needs. And we want to figure out how do these 2 levels of life needs affect each other, and which is more important, which is more basic. And this paper has following research significance. The first is, this paper provides empirical evidence of causal effects of physical satisfaction and spiritual stability during the settlement process of mobile population. And this paper also demonstrates the indirect effects of spiritual stability of mobile population. Last but not least, this paper proposes policy advice for local government to attract talents and develop economy. This paper's research framework, including 5 parts, that is, introduction, literature review, theoretical explanation of new urban migrant settlement intention and the background of regional competition, econometric models, and empirical studies. Last, conclusions and policy suggestions. And next, let's move on to literature about migration in China. And here are 3 topics. The first is historical migration activities. Due to the long-term dominance of agriculture in ancient China, the spatial mobility of population was very low. That is because the core capital of agriculture is land, and the land is focused, so the migration rate is low. and the north-south population distribution pattern in China was affected by Anshi Rebellion, and the east-west pattern was triggered by sudden climatic changes. In a word, the population distribution pattern of China is decided by the geographic characteristics and historical events. The second topic is who is migrating. In 1978, the large-scale migration of population formed by industrialization and urbanization came into being, and urban-rural migration became the mainstream. And since the 1990s, domestic population mobility patterns have shifted from individualized mobility to family-based mobility. It is very easy to understand. Just think about that. A worker or a pair of workers, they have a marriage. Their children, their old parents, they follow them to a new city to settle down, to live with them. And the third topic is factors influencing migration behaviors of mobile population. The economic factors such as non-farm work experience, house prices, expected urban income gap, employment quality, education disparities, public service provision, and environmental pollution. All these factors can be integrated into one part, that is, physical life needs, and moreover, cultural and social factors such as common dialect areas, social integration, and the sense of urban belonging also affect the new urban migrants' intention to settle down. And let me show you the research method of this paper. The basic model of this paper is binary response model. That is because the intention of new urban migrants to settle is very easy to answer with the choice of yes or no. So we use a binary response model such as logit and probit model, and the variable is the settlement intention of city level data, which is released in 2018, and the data is from China Migrants Dynamic Survey and China Urban Statistical Yearbook. And this paper have two theoretical hypotheses. The first is physical and spiritual needs influence the willingness of new urban migrants to settle. And the second is the realization of material needs of new urban migrants promotes the satisfaction of their spiritual needs, and the satisfaction of spiritual needs has an indirect effect. In the last part of our paper, we tested the conclusions with changing models and redefining dependent variable, and we found our conclusion are convincing. And here is a table of the core analysis in this paper, that is, comprehensive evaluation system of urban new migrant settlement needs. And here is our conclusion of this paper. The conclusion is including two parts. The first is factors such as living environment, material life, physical health, and cultural life influence the settlement behavior of new urban migrants in the inflow area. And this is a response to the first hypothesis. Second is the satisfaction of physical needs is conducive to the spiritual stability of new urban migrants in inflow place, which further influences their willingness to settle. And here are the innovations of this paper. First, a comprehensive evaluation system is established for the settlement needs of new urban migrants using data from 286 cities in China in 2018 in order to provide empirical evidence for understanding the effects of physical cultivation and spiritual stability on settlement behavior among new urban migrants. Second, the indirect effects of spiritual needs of new urban migrants are examined to confirm the mechanism of action that shape physical needs, spiritual needs, and settlement behavior. And here is our reference. That's all the contents of my presentation. Thanks for listening.
Welcome.
The panel chair can go on.
I think.
Okay. Now, all the reporters has displayed their video. So now let's start discussion. If you had any questions to discuss with the reporters, there are two ways to put forward questions. One is put forward the questions in the chat area, or you can put forward questions orally. So now let's begin. I would like to say, firstly, I want to say something about the cases from Burkina Faso. I think the case of Burkina Faso have many implications for us. Firstly, a stable political environment is essential for the developing countries. Secondly, developing countries should realize the rapid urbanization by developing industries. It can provide more jobs and solve the livelihood problems of the rural population after the rapid urbanization. Finally, resilient cities should be a composite concept. Under the influence of COVID-19, all the government should put people firstly and enhance the realizations of urban economic development, social governance, and ecological and environment. So my question is, urbanization cannot solve all the problems facing urban development. Now, how to solve the development of rural-urban continuum after rapid urbanization? How to solve the simultaneous development of urbanization and industrializations?
I guess if I can jump in the Burkina Faso context, as Stephanie was saying, that it's very important that they take an intersectoral approach to urban planning. It's not just urban planning, it's looking at food security, it's looking at local economic development, it's looking at how these all interrelate to sanitation, hygiene, education. So I guess it's like whole of government approaches. In particular for Burkina Faso, it's one of the UN pilot countries for the humanitarian development and peace nexus. So in all the programming, we have to think about short-term needs, because this is a humanitarian crisis, but also long-term needs, and how we can address both of these in more general development, not just urban development. And you also had a good point about the crisis situation, which also maybe confuses the response, because we constantly have to think about the social cohesion between the host communities and then the displaced populations, and be very careful that any of our projects are benefiting both communities, because often a source of intercommunal conflict is the perception that one community is benefiting over the other. And in relation to the security context as well, it's very important that the government is seen to be supplying public goods in that way. So by working with the government in those kind of ways, we can increase the public's trust in the local government to supply them with urban services in those kind of ways. So I guess looking at local actors, looking at economic development and intersectoral approaches is the way we try to expand our urban planning to address more long-term needs, if that is addressing your question.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Question. I have a question. I have a question for Owen. Owen, right?
No, Owen. It's a very hard name.
Owen. Oh, it's just Owen. Okay. Yeah. First, thank you for the presentation. Your great work as a group. And my question is like a very general question. I just want to know, how do you distinguish between the resettlement, versus the displacement? Because you know, like there's a whole bunch of literature talking about the involuntary resettlement, and I think in your case you mentioned you use the term displacement. So I'm just curious, like how do you define these two terms and distinguish between them? Thank you.
So I guess when we're talking about displacement, we're talking about people who've fled from rural areas and then usually arrive to the urban periphery and set up where they could find housing. So they haven't been settled by the government in that way. They've just often been either taken in by the host community where possible, or developed informal housing where they could, with, as you saw in the photos there, materials that they could find at the time. So I guess that's how we would frame the displacement or IDP. So it's not so much in terms of resettlement. The government hasn't really got or has the capacity often to even be thinking about resettling these populations. I guess in the immediate term, it's just about giving them immediate access to basic urban services.
Okay, and also on that note, I'm curious because in the Asian, like South Asian context, you always see the development-induced resettlement, and I'm curious. In Africa, is that a common situation? Like, is the resettlement more common, or the displacement are often seen in real days?
Mm-hmm. At least from what I know in the Burkina Faso context, resettlement has not been a big part of the conversation within the crisis. I know I also do some work in northwest Kenya, in Turkana refugee camp, and there I guess resettlement is a big part of the conversation. And then also within that, it becomes a big issue between, are these characterized as migrants or are they characterized as asylum seekers if they're coming over the border? And that's a big conflict often with government people about which definition do these population groups receive, because if it's refugees, it's much harder to resettle them because then they get certain protections within their status. But if they're migrants, then they can be very easily resettled by the government or put back across the border. So I think that in more of the, maybe an East African context, that becomes a bigger part of the work of UN Habitat. But I think within the Burkina Faso context, where I know more, it's much more on spontaneous displacement, either due to the conflict, but also I guess climate impacts are also causing a lot of displacement for rural people into urban centers. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Any other question about the kids from Burkina Faso?
Yeah, my own is, I want to thank Owen and Stephanie for a very good presentation. And I'm equally happy with what my colleague actually pointed out, that we have a lot to learn from Burkina Faso example, most especially in terms of countries that are facing a lot of crisis due to displacement, and the emphasis that urbanization cannot be expected to solve all the social, economic, environmental problems which we encounter. I want to find out from them, because this will be a very good shared experience what kind of multilateral governance do you recommend to address issues of conflict? Because this is quite a very important issue for us to take home from this conference. What kind of multilateral government or governance do you suggest? Is this social development, education? Can you share a bit of these experiences of what you people recommended, please? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I guess in terms of urban governance in Burkina Faso, it's about looking at the different levels of government that we need to work with to address the conflict, looking at developing local capacity as much as possible, not just the national capacity. As Stephanie was saying in her presentation, often the urban policies are made at a national level, but implemented at a local level. So in terms of urban governance, we're often focused on building the capacity of the municipalities of very small towns and urban centers, with the idea that these secondary towns can be a bit of a bulwark to stop the mass urbanization of the capital, Ouagadougou. So the idea is to make these nodes of secondary urbanization centers. In terms of internationally within the conflict, I guess UN Habitat tries to work across borders to engage with the conflict situation to try and manage urbanization in that way. But often then that kind of international work is a bit outside of the mandate of our organization to engage like that multilaterally. If that answers your question, Dr. George.
Yes, it's answered. Thank you so much, especially scaling down from national level to the local authorities.
Yes.
Thank you. That's a very expository explanation. Thank you.
Okay, any other question? Now we move to the second quarter.
I have a question for Chen Yang. My question has to do with a very interesting presentation. Most especially, I will actually look at your presentation from research. You actually covered a lot of area in terms of literature review. I'm equally happy with your conceptual framework. I want you to share some light in terms of the China urbanization. You mentioned issues of a lot of paradigm shift. I want you to share with our colleagues here, what are those paradigm shifts, especially in areas of urban-rural relations, which you felt has passed a couple of transformation. I think these are areas of which you would like to share some experiences. Another thing I equally would like to appraise based on your presentation, which I feel is one of the things we should equally enable our students to actually work on, village classification. I think I'm happy to see a presentation touching on issues of village classification. So can you share with us some experiences in terms of what are those transformations? I think you related it in areas of urban-rural integration. Because we have in our African context, where we have a high level of urbanization from rural area to the urban areas, in search of jobs, in search of better lives, in search of education. But you are sharing with us in terms of what we classify as backwash effect, urban-rural integration. So I want to find out from you, what are those transformations, if you don't mind? Thank you.
Just for clarification, you're talking about the transformation from the rural to urban, or the transformation of policies in China?
Area I'm looking at is on areas of urban-rural integration. Share with us those transformations which you feel you were able to find out in your research studies.
Yes, so my case is about Hangzhou, and for those who don't know the context, Hangzhou is is in the coastal region of China, and is a very developed city. So it has a urbanization rate at 77%. So wait, I will give you a very quick introduction of the. So basically, yeah. So what I'm talking about is like China, the urban-rural relations in China has undergone very intensive transformations. So basically, because China's socialist ideology demands an ultimate urban-rural integration rather than the urban-rural antagonism that is bound to happen in the capitalist development. And against this backdrop, so China has implemented the coordinated urban-rural development strategies in the from 2002, and later on, the urban-rural integration has become macro policy and as a national priority of rural reforms and in China's subsequent 5-year plans. And also in recent years, we see a very emphasis on the initiative of rural revitalization, and the most recent attempt was made by the central state to establish a Commonwealth demonstration zone in Zhejiang province. So this is the transformation from the old urban biased development mode to a urban-rural integrated development mode. And as for the village classification case, so it is basically a strategy implemented by the local government first to classify the different priorities for those development priorities for those villages, and then try to implement the tailored strategies to help those villages on the one hand to become more urbanized, and on the other hand to try to attract the as I mentioned, the capitals, the people, the labels from the urban back to the village, back to the rural side. So that's kind of different from the conceptual framework or the development mode as we see in the Western literature. In like people are sucked into the cities with the urban agglomeration effect that's playing the dominant role. While in China, you have this state intervention that forcefully reverse this kind of flow that makes it work.
Okay.
Georgia, yeah.
Dr. George?
Thank you. I think my question is answered. I have the last question for you and your student.
Okay.
That question is on the research methodology used. I'm equally happy in terms of what you pointed out, most especially touching on issues of urban-rural migration, which you people in your research, you were able to find out it has become a mainstream. So I want to find out in terms of your research methodology, which you used in terms of the basic model, trickle down to economic model. Why did you use this methodology? Because I didn't see other options. Why did you people choose this particular research methodology?
Okay, we use binary value response model because we use a survey that investigates the migrant intentions of the migrants, and there are some questions in the survey, and actually the question is, will you settle down in this area, or how long will you settle down in this area? So the answer of the question is very clear, yes or no. So it is a true value answer. So we use the binary response model. Have I answered your question?
No, my question is, did you, because from literature review, we need to see some other model which you use. Did you use any other model before you settle down on this?
美林，我来说，他问你的问题是
哦
为什么你要用这个模型？为什么选这个模型，而不是说你那个2值模型是怎么来的？
为什么要选这个模型？
你选这个模型的原因是什么？
Because we want to figure out how this economic variables and social cultural variables, how this all factors affect the migrant intentions of the new urban migrants. So we control some variables and research and figure out the main variables which affect the migrant intentions, and as the dependent variable, the migrant intentions is a true value variable, so we use this model.
Okay, thank you so much. The reason why, because you know, this is a research, and I know you come out with a very good report in this thing. When you look at your research objectives and the significance, we touch on a lot of issues of cultural as well as social factors. And in most studies, we find it difficult to quantify those cultural and social factors. So that is the reason why I'm asking you this question. So thank you. I'm happy with your explanation. It satisfies me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, all the reporters. After more than 1 hour discussion, we had in-depth and detailed communication. We gained new friends, new knowledge, and new suggestions in different fields. So thank you very much. Let's meet again next year. Bye-bye.
See you guys. Thank you very much. See you.
Thanks all. See ya.
Thank you guys.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Parce que là, quand Thank you.